The US has struck desalination plants in Iran. Iran has struck desalination plants in the Gulf, and now UAE has struck more desalination plants.
It's not possible that we're talking about the security challenges that the young generation is going to inherit, and we cannot talk about Middle East right now. Do you think the next generation can survive this prolonged war? Because nobody thought that this is going to come to Dubai. Now, if this comes to Dubai, and as you spoke about that, people used to talk about how US and Iran strike or Israel and Iran strike would be the end game.
There will be mass layoffs. There will be, people will be able to earn less money. The value of money is going to be less and less stable.
You wake up and then you're hearing about a war opening here and then another frontier opening there.
Conventional capabilities is definitely a very, very important objective. And I think our own country should be spending much more money than merely 2% of our GDP, who's trying to pressurize the regime in Cuba, who's done this, outright sort of murder of Ayatollah Khamenei in Iran. I mean, the list just goes on.
Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the second edition of the NATO India Youth Conference. And today, what an honor it is for us to host the ever magnificent Dr. Swasti Rao. Dr. Rao, how are you doing?
Oh, I'm very well, Pratyaksh. What a pleasure to be back at the NATO Youth Conference.
Now, for our audience, Dr. Rao is the Associate Dean and Associate Professor at the Jindal School of International Affairs, and she's also the Consulting Editor at The Print. I also recently came across the fact that you're also doing something with the Ministry of Defense. Could you tell us something about that?
Yeah, Pratyaksh. So I was actually working earlier for the MOD think tank, and I left it about 2 years ago. But I continue being in a advisory and consultant role. So I'm an advisor consultant to our MOD on a flagship project called the Defense Industrial Corridor. So basically for procurement and for investments in procurement and weapons and stuff like that. So I continue being with the MOD there.
Given that you have these wide roles when it comes to being the consulting editor, working with the Ministry of Defense, and we are here at the NATO India Youth Conference, I want to ask you this question that suddenly there is more of talks between NATO and India here in New Delhi. And which is something that we were talking about that some years ago, it used to be not something, it used to be like a no thing. But now the thing has increased. Why do you think this is happening, and why do you think NATO and India are talking to each other so openly now?
Well, I'm glad really you asked me this question, Pratyaksh, because just to sort of give a bit of a background to why what we are doing today is something nobody could have imagined about 2, 3 years ago. Like I said, that I was earlier working at the MOD think tank and I was working at the Europe Center. So I was very much working on European security, Russia-Ukraine war, its implications, etc. And back then, it was very clear that Euro-Atlantic security is going to have more and more convergence with Indo-Pacific security. I think the contours were very, very clear. Okay, but it's just that because NATO, the minute you say NATO, and especially countries that are loosely referred to as global South, like developing countries, India being one of them, NATO has a very, very pejorative view. It's a very negative view. But why? Because of its misadventures in Iraq and Afghanistan. So 3 years ago, 4 years ago, in Delhi corridors, if you said, well, let's talk to NATO, or NATO wants to talk to India, you would have met with a lot of raised eyebrows. Why? I mean, India is not going to be a member to NATO, right? Missing the point that NATO's strategic concept of 2022, which came out in the Madrid summit, I think 3, 4 months after the war in Ukraine broke out in February, sort of underscored very, very clearly that for the next 10 years, because strategic concept is basically a 10-yearly document that NATO brings out, it's like a vision document, where for the first time of course, they alluded to the fact that there is a big war going on in the European theater, but they also listed China as a primary challenge. And if you go through the 13 pages of that document, it has about 49, 50 points. You see very, very clearly that it talks about cybersecurity, it talks about terrorism, it talks about emerging threats and disruptive technologies in Indo-Pacific. So if I wouldn't be calling it an Indo-Pacific pivot, but at least a very, very clear and coherent approach to engaging the Indo-Pacific. And naturally, the minute you say Indo-Pacific, you have to look at beyond NATO members, right? Because NATO's members, the 32 members that NATO has, are all belonging to the European sphere. Then there are NATO sort of plus members, like, for example, the Asia-Pacific partners of NATO, Japan, Australia, New Zealand, etc. They're all treaty partners to the United States. But then comes India, right? Because India is not a NATO member. India is not formally on board anywhere in NATO. And yet, the strategic concept of 2022 creates that analytical paradigm for the two sides to talk. Why? Because we share a common perception of threats and therefore a convergence of interest, which is disruptive technologies, which is protection of critical infrastructure, which is counterterrorism, etc., so on and so forth. So that is why the reason that, or that is why the fact that we are having, and I think this is the second time you're holding it, but if you see that NATO India track 1.5 and also unofficial communication has been on an upward trend in the last 2 3 years, is something which was always meant to be, especially after the strategic concept, etc. But I think I'm very happy that now there is more awareness on this part, because let's not forget that if you look at the European theater, especially in Helsinki, which is just the border, of the Russian Finland Russia border, there is something called a hybrid center of excellence, which is a sort of a organization where NATO and European Union and certain other countries are members. And what the hybrid center of excellence does is that center of excellence there in Helsinki puts together a very robust response mechanism for tackling hybrid threats. So they already have a lot of, I would say, good practices, a lot of technological capabilities that they can actually bring to Indo-Pacific. And that is exactly why we are having this conversation, and we must have this conversation, because what they bring is expertise. What we can sort of bring here is the fact that we are economies of scale, right? And nobody can sort of deny the fact that today, if you're talking or having any security conversation in the Indian Ocean region or larger in Indo-Pacific, you have to engage India. So it's like it's sort of fallen into place at a time when I think the world really needs to have a 360-degree approach towards security, which is very much the rationale of the NATO's 2022 strategic concept as well.
I mean, I'm so glad to hear that, again, to hear from you that how India and NATO are coming closer and how that's a great thing. And to we actually do that in a podcast at the NATO India Youth Conference is just something that, it's quite poetic. Now, coming back onto the things that you were speaking about. So you spoke about now, this is something that people usually do not think about. You said that NATO and India, they have some common perceptions of threat, right? And you spoke about disruptive technologies.
Yeah.
In that context, can you tell us about your analysis of what is the security environment right now? Because of course, looking at the world right now, we're facing so many challenges. Where do you think we're facing the security challenges globally?
Well, Pratyaksh, I think this is probably the sine qua non. This is the most important question today, because we are not just dealing with one war in Russia and Ukraine, which obviously had every single marker to become a grinding war of attrition that it has become now. It has entered its fifth year. And now we have another worst case scenario unfolding in the West Asian region or the Middle Eastern region, whichever way you want to put it. And if you look closely, right, one of the things that I have been working on, obviously, I work on the Russia-Ukraine theater quite a lot, but one of the things that I have been noticing and working on, like for example, my book on the Russia-Ukraine war is called Ukraine Untold. And why is it called Untold? Is because I sort of realized that everybody knows the reason why the Russia-Ukraine war is happening, whether you want to side with Russia or Ukraine, that's a different thing. But the untold part there is trying to capture the way in which the Ukraine war and its second order and third order implications have spilled in other theaters. That has ramifications for the Caucasus, which is Armenia, Azerbaijan, Georgia, which has ramifications for Middle East in terms of Syria, etc. Ukrainian intelligence had a role to play there. Also in terms of Russia having its bases in Syria and sort of helping its access against Ukraine from Crimea, in Sahel region in North Africa, okay, and Indo-Pacific, which is very clear because North Koreans are fighting along with Russians. So the untold part is about how it has spilled over, not just in terms of other geographies, I think, which is the easier part to map. The more complicated things, Pratyaksh, comes from mapping the data and technology leakage. We are living in a very, very dangerous situation where what we have seen from the Russia Ukraine experience, and now what we are also seeing in the US Israel versus Iran experience, is that there is a weaponization of everything. Wars have become technological innovation competitions. um, Both sides, I mean, our adversaries are very quick at adapting. So there is the the technological innovation that you see happening in wars have a window of about 4 5 months, after which that technology becomes redundant and a new technology comes. For example, you may be noticing how today, as we are speaking, there is just so much discussion from the West Asian theater about trying to get Ukrainian experts to try and to take down Shahid drones, because Shahid drones are creating literally havoc in the very stable Gulf monarchies and the Gulf cities which were created as very safe havens, whether it's Dubai or Abu Dhabi, etc., or Doha, etc. Now, what it basically shows is that, of course, we are not here talking about the war, and of course, I want to come back to how this technology is disruptive. So, quickly, the thing that I wish to underscore here for you and for the audience is that we are living in a very dangerous era of military tech innovation. Okay, innovation is a good thing, but at the same time, it is also a growing risk that that innovation is actually falling into the hands of people, of non-state actors, of a lot of unregulated people, tech that are willing to sell it at a certain price to other people. So, for example, a couple of things that people don't tend to sort of realize about the Russia-Ukraine war is that there is also a proxy war between Russia and Ukraine that is going on in Mali and Central African republics, where Ukraine and Russia are sort of, where Russia obviously has the Wagner groups and all those, those kind of private military companies, and Ukrainians and their drone operators are supporting proxies there as well. Again, this is to underscore that in a very fast evolving environment, which is naturally getting very, very militarized, it is not just about data protection, which is going to be done by the big tech, right? It is data and it is innovation which is being done by very young people who are there to basically give very quick solutions to their governments, and there is also this risk of them selling it to people who will not be able basically we are not able to really develop the control in the same pace as the technology is growing. So the military tech innovation is a positive thing, but the military tech leakage is something which is very, very dangerous.
Dr. Rao, you've had an extended view over these security matters, so that gives you a very bird's eye perspective over things. And given how, young people, they seem to like you a lot, and, your analysis as well, in terms of those things, do you think that as young people, you've described how that tech military alliance is so great, but the dual usage of it becomes really
The
dangerous?
leakage part, we are not
Yes.
able to control. There's a lot of pilferage happening.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So now coming on to that, do you think that young people are, inheriting security challenges
Yeah.
that are so absolutely different from what it used to be even some decades ago?
Absolutely, Pratyaksh. I cannot really, agree more with this point that, and I keep giving this metaphor a lot to my own students a lot of times, and to a lot of lectures I go and give here and there, especially when there are like youngsters. I really tell them that the kind of world that you are inheriting today is radically, it's like fundamentally radically different from the kind of world that we inherited when we were undergrads or master's students, etc. Then the world looked like a global village. Everything seemed to be within our reach. I mean, of course, there were like small localized conflicts here and there. I mean, there've been unending conflicts in Africa. Nobody talks about them. There is an Africa fatigue, etc. There's also some frozen conflicts here and there. There was also, cross-border terrorism. So those kind of things were there. But like full-fledged wars with this kind of unending ramifications, second order, third order implications, every single thing that you can think of getting weaponized, whether it's people, whether it's data, whether it's water. I mean, now as we are speaking, we know that the US has struck desalination plants in Iran. Iran has struck desalination plants in the Gulf, and now UAE has struck more desalination plants. Do you understand the magnitude of this problem? I mean, the entire Gulf success story is built on that fresh water that they do not have. That they have these huge desalination plants that they're not only their industrial capacities or their energy infrastructure is dependent on, but their populations are dependent on. So in the Russia-Ukraine theater, we were looking at the crisis of food, fuel, and fertilizer. We were looking at the crisis of how energy sort of got weaponized in a manner that we had not really seen in many, many decades. And now, you look at the Middle Eastern theater, and you have water getting sort of weaponized. So you are inheriting a very, very unstable world where everything, every commodity can be potentially weaponized, right? And then let's not forget that we are also living in a world with lot of disruptive technologies, and we should talk a little bit about that, because I think disruptive technology is a term that everybody keeps using, but not many actually get into the nitty gritty of what it is. So, for example, India also happens to be one of the most cyber attacked countries in the world, right? So, how do you create capabilities around cybersecurity? How do you create capabilities around protecting data centers? In fact, what we saw in the Middle Eastern experience was very early on, Iran by the third day had already struck a data center. Amazon data center, I think, if I'm not wrong, in Abu Dhabi or UAE. Okay, so data centers. Now, today we know that what is projected is about 9 trillion or $8.7 trillion worth of global GDP today is at risk, because so much of that has been dataized, right? I mean, there's so much of datafication happening. And if those data centers are going to be at risk, how are we going to sort of solve this problem in coming days and months, right? And years, of course. So when I say about what kind of a security challenge are you going to inherit, you're going to be inheriting a lot of long-standing wars of grinding attrition. Your generation is going to inherit a world which is hugely militarized already. The global military spending, is growing at I think an annual rate of about 15% or something, between 10 and 15%. And in by 2035, it was already projected to cross $7 trillion. I mean, $7 trillion it was projected to cross. And these projections came before the Middle Eastern situation got so out of hand. So now, if you add how much, once the war ends, and I hope it is soon, but whenever the war ends, the kind of militarization, because remember, all these wars means also a lot of depletion of stockpiles, right? A lot of depletion of interceptors, of air defenses, of ammunition, etc. So you will see not just 7 trillion, but I don't know, maybe twice as much or thrice as much money going only in militarization. You're also going to be inheriting a world where you will have a significantly higher carbon footprint, because just as there's another thing, Pratyush, and I have worked a bit on it, I've written on it, that just as we are always talking about, decarbonization, etc., in big corporate, okay, big tech and big corporate, we those data, the data numbers that you see there, they do not reflect the global military footprint. And when you are talking about a world which is constantly sort of swinging between wars and military conflict, etc., we don't even have an assessment of how much more serious that total carbon footprint really is, right? That, for example, what NATO perhaps is doing. So, for example, one of the things that I wrote in that chapter of mine, you can put it in the description box for those of you who like to read it. One of the things that I mentioned in the chapter was that, in fact, NATO is one of the pioneers in military decarbonization efforts. So NATO spends a lot of money there, So that's what I'm trying to say, that everything is weaponized, more militarization, more carbonization, etc., and a lot of uncertainty. So just my concluding remark for this part would be that yes, the world is very unpredictable and the world is very complex. What we can do is that perhaps we cannot decrease, or we cannot really work on bringing down the unpredictability part, because we have leaders like Donald Trump. We have very, we have leaders where they want to leave a legacy. We have a Bibi Netanyahu, we have a Donald Trump, we also have a Putin, etc., etc. So where they feel that continuing with wars is perhaps more conducive to their style of, I think, political legacies, regardless of what is happening in the world. So anyway, and then we have a Xi Jinping. Of course, we have to naturally be talking about our neighbor here, and we have, on our west we have a Pakistan. So I'm just talking about these kind of things. So just to sort of end this particular discussion, what I wish to underscore is that just as you cannot really decrease or work on the unpredictability part, because with so many leaders wanting to leave their legacies, what we can do definitely as academics, as researchers, and anybody who's interested in geopolitics is to try and demystify certain phenomena that is going to reduce the complexity of the matter a bit, so you just understand it better, even if you're not able to bring down the unpredictability part, right? So this is, I think, what I always tell the students, that try to sort of demystify phenomena, because that is going to help you sort of bring down the unpredictability in its own way a little bit.
You spoke deeply about how the world is increasingly becoming more militarized. And, as a young person myself right now, I find that thought a little bit strange to me, and I'll tell you why. Because when I was growing up, I've grown up in times when it used to be a bit more peaceful
Yeah,
than
yeah,
compared to right now. And then we were taught and made to believe that the world has moved past these long attrition of wars,
yeah.
and the world is becoming a peaceful place. Although of course conflicts and wars, they've always existed, but right now it seems, as you spoke about, this militarization, be it of tech, be it of supply chains, is much more in your face as a common citizen, right? Previously it used to be for like war journalists, but right now as a common man, you wake up and then you're hearing about a war opening here and then another frontier opening there. My question to you is that, again, because we were living some years ago in sort of peaceful times relatively, and now there's so much frequency of what's happening. Why do you think this is emerging? How is this landscape emerging that so suddenly so many wars are starting?
Yeah, so I mean, honestly, it's very difficult for me to actually tell you a starting point, so to say. But for sure, if you look at how the world was just before COVID versus how the world seems to be now, there is a major difference. You see, I mean, like you said, and I think it's a very important point to underscore, that it is not to sort of push the narrative that everything was hunky dory. Things have never been hunky dory. There have been communities at war. There have been mass killings happening. Like, for example, this Iranian regime that we keep talking about. I mean, for the last 47 years, I mean, how have they become so centralized and so powerful? If you go into the history, you understand that there have been mass killings happening. They've always tried to suppress, right, etc. So this is not to sort of discount that there was no violence or there was no I mean, localized conflicts, etc. But on a global scale, right, in a manner in which superpowers sort of, like, for example, I mean, this is just to tell you because we are talking about NATO, and I think a bit of history is going to be very interesting. I told you about the strategic concept, right, which is a vision document that NATO comes out with almost every 10 years. So if you look at so 2022 was the latest one, and then before that is the 2012 and 2002, those kind of. So in some of the previous vision documents of NATO, strategic concepts of NATO, Russia was listed as a strategic partner, right? So what I'm saying is that if you look at the big power equilibrium, you perhaps expected a stability at that level. That was also coming from the fact that all of these factors or all of these powers were nuclear powers, right? So, they were engaged in strategic reduction of arms, and they were, those kind of things. There was also a stability at the top, right? That they are not going to be engaging in at least direct conflicts. Of course, that was always supposed to be the worst case scenarios, right? And also, if you look at the Middle Eastern region, if you remember, Donald Trump in 2020, how on earth did he get away with something like an Abraham Accord, which was normalization? Why? Because there was a tacit understanding that the Middle Eastern region has to sort of come out of the spiral of violence. And even though Iran and its proxies have been problematic, and yet there is a possibility that at least Israel and the Gulf countries normalize. And that is from where concepts such as I2U2 for India, the Strategic Quadrilateral, or IMEC connectivity project were all springing from that normalization, which basically alluded to the fact that yes, there are divergences and there are internal sort of, so to say, destabilizing factors, but at the same time, it is in everybody's interest to try and end the spiral of violence. And just few years after that, there was also a normalization that was attempted by China between Saudi Arabia and Iran. Not many people know about it. Where was that coming from? Because it was in China's interest. China was becoming a major player in the Gulf. China had a lot of investments with Saudi Arabia. China had $400 billion worth of investments in Iran. It made sense for China to try and normalize situation there as well. Now, this is again to sort of just to help you understand that this is not to say that there were no problems and everybody was agreeing to everything, to the same things. But whatever the disturbances were, they were always operating at a level which was below the threshold of full-fledged conventional military conflict. There was weaponization, etc., happening. There was a lot of energy pipeline politics. All of that was going on, and yet we did not see people being killed or tanks being rolled. that changed. If you remember COVID, everybody was talking about resilience of supply chains. That was suddenly everybody got aware about how the Nagoya style of because the Japanese have a philosophy that there is a just in time system and a just in case system, which basically means that why would you need if and this entire concept of bringing in more efficiency, right? So efficiency meant that if you have to overall create a system which is efficient, basically, cost efficient, time efficient, that is what COVID taught us, that if you're building too much efficient systems, you are also creating dependencies. Therefore, you have to build not just efficient systems, but resilient systems. And therefore, you have to reduce your dependencies, create diversification. So I think that was the main conversation after COVID. And then Russia-Ukraine war started, isn't it? And ever since, we've been living in an era of uncertainty and an era of military conflict. When you say that where has this changed or where is it going, like I'm saying, that the problem is that we are today dealing with a world where many of these countries and prominent countries, so for example, such as the Ayatollah regime in Iran, or for example, Bibi Netanyahu, of course, it's a wrong example. I mean, so please don't imagine that these are all similar countries, but I'm just talking about leaders that are really obsessed with leaving legacies. Okay, for example, Vladimir Putin, or for example, Xi Jinping, right? For them, the most important thing is to leave behind a legacy. So, for example, Xi Jinping, for example, wants to outdo Mao. So he wants to be remembered as the greatest leader of the CCP. And how does he do that? The only way he can do that is by uniting or unifying the five stars on the Chinese flag, which means reunification with Taiwan, which means reunification with all the other regions that China considers its right, its territories, and it has a problem because we have a problem there. Okay, so that is a problem, and when you are looking at this kind of a legacy obsession, you are dealing with leaders that are not necessarily rational in the technical sense, because they are not looking at a cost benefit scenario, right? Even if there is cost, they are willing to absorb the cost because they want to leave a legacy. This is exactly the pattern that we see in Russia unfolding. I mean, Russia getting entrenched in a war of attrition in Ukraine. This is which is now in its fifth year, and nobody really knows how long it's going to go, because Donald Trump said he will end it in 24 hours. He's not been able to, right? Because there's also technologically it has become very, very advanced. Now, what do you see? Vladimir Putin wants to leave a legacy. He wants to become, or he wants to be remembered in the same league as Peter the Great, Catherine the Great, etc. Right? That is what makes it so dangerous. That even though they understand that they are bleeding their countries and their economies, and yet they have entrenched themselves so much into that idea that they don't want to come out. Now, this is again not to say that Vladimir Putin thinks exactly the same way as Xi Jinping does, but it creates a lot of uncertainty in the world, because imagine 3 years ago, everybody was saying that an Israel Iran direct confrontation is a worst case scenario. If that happens, it will be World War III. We are already in the second round of it, right? So that is something, that legacy question, that is becoming more and more central to a lot of strategic calculus of a lot of leaders in the world, including Mr. Donald Trump, who has ousted Nicolas Maduro from Venezuela, who's trying to pressurize the regime in Cuba, who's done this, how do I say, outright sort of murder of Ayatollah Khamenei in Iran. I mean, the list just goes on, right? So suddenly, it is not just a democracy versus autocracy problem. It is about certain leaders who are willing to risk everything because they want to leave a legacy. And that creates, in my view, a really big problem for the generation that is going to inherit the world that these guys are leaving behind.
You know, so COVID was really a black swan event in that
Yeah.
sense, because the way you've put it, this legacy question has emerged after COVID very prominently,
Yeah.
and it's leading to rise of so many conflicts in the world. Now the thing is, you spoke about how previously there used to be dependencies, and now the world is chasing these to build these resilient
Resilience.
systems.
Yeah.
And now when we look at the war, for example, let's talk about Middle East, right?
Yeah.
It's not possible that we're talking about the security challenges that the young generation is going to inherit,
Yeah.
and we cannot talk about Middle East right now.
Yeah. Yeah.
Now, Middle East, for the longest time, they've been trying to build a resilient system for themselves, and nobody really saw that US Iran strikes will somehow lead to, as a second order effect or even the third order effect, strikes on Dubai, right?
Of course, yeah, of
And
course.
given that they act as a literal transport hub for the world, and there's so much money going over there and so
Yeah,
much
yeah.
oil, now when war comes to these resilient systems, how do you think the next generation can, survive this prolonged war? Because nobody thought that this is going to come to Dubai. Now if this comes to Dubai, and as you spoke about that, oh, people used to talk about how US and Iran strike, or Israel and Iran strike would be the end game, and you said we're already in the
We are
second.
already in that dystopia, yeah. So,
Yes.
yeah.
So now when this thing is happening, how do you think the young generation will be able to, sort of survive these things, because we've never been through
Correct.
these changes?
Correct. It's not just that, Pratyaksh. And I hate to sound more dystopian than we've already been, but I hate to sound more dystopian. But just add to that, or just throw all the challenges that AI brings to this very, very unstable region. Just as we were talking about how AI is going to cost a lot of jobs, how AI is going to take away a lot of jobs. You also have a scenario where at least the safe havens are no longer able to sort of really provide that financial security and stability, right? So you will see, more unemployment. There will be mass layoffs, right? There will be, I mean, people will be able to earn less money. The value of money is going to be, less and less stable. I mean, these are going to be the immediate fallouts, and it will take a long time to build a different system, because that's exactly what we're talking about. When two big powers go to war with each other, at least in today's day and age, right? They are going to war. What happened? The Americans and the Israelis, they started Operation Epic Fury. America called it Operation Epic Fury. Israel called it Operation Roaring Lion. The previous one was the 12-day war, was called Rising Lion. Now, when they launched this operation, what did Iran do? Iran did not strike so much American facilities. They did a few here and there, but they did not strike Israel and America so much. Who did they strike? They struck UAE. Right? Why? UAE is the financial Emiratis, the Emirati business model, right? They have financial depth all over the region. I mean, they are the new London now. The money laundering, and the financial networks of how money passes from one hand to another. Most of that for the entire world is happening in Abu Dhabi. Okay, it is not happening any other place. That is what they chose to strike. Abu Dhabi. They chose to strike Dubai. They chose to strike Aramco. So energy facilities, oil facilities, financial networks, Amazon data center. A lot of these. So the natural question is, Iran was not at war with UAE, right? Iran was at war with Israel and America. Why was it striking Kuwait and Saudi Arabia and Bahrain and Jordan and Azerbaijan, for example? Okay, why Cyprus? I mean, it doesn't make sense. Why? Because it knows that by doing this, it is going to create far, far, far more pressure on America and Israel to stop the war, because then the Gulf countries are going to pressurize them. You cannot go on with this madness. But then again, there is a cost. Now, the Gulf countries also understand that if they stop midway, right, they might be able to sort of, just, I mean, th- th- what they understand is that now if they stop midway, they will never be able to draw a red line. Okay, so this is a very, very, in fact, some analysts in the West have called it, I don't know if your audience would be aware of this metaphor, but there is a metaphor in quantum mechanics. It's called the Schrodinger's cat,
Yes,
which is dead
absolutely.
and
Yes.
alive at the same time, right? So basically what it shows is the complexity of a situation where, I mean, you are inside a war and you want to be outside the war at the same time, and you do not know the real impact till the time all the cards are open. It is a very, very unprecedented situation. Of course, the human tragedy is the most obvious one, but the larger questions are going to be, like I said, the environmental degradation, all the money which is going to be now focused more on military. So these countries, that sort of put together this wonderful economic model of prosperity, of stability, in a very, very unstable region, right? You have a bleeding Syria in the middle of this. You have a bleeding Gaza. You have a West Bank. You have in Iraq. You have Hezbollah in Lebanon. All of that was already there, and yet all these Gulf rich countries were able to create safe havens. So all of that money that went into this infrastructure development is now going to go to militarization, which is very, very obvious. So this is definitely going to create a lot of challenges for the youngsters that are now going to enter the job markets, etc. So, the only one key takeaway that I can tell you, and perhaps a silver lining out of this tragedy, is that please think very, very seriously about defense startups. Please think very, very seriously about innovative methods because, listen, one thing that we need to underscore is that, and NATO also talks about that, and it is important that we should highlight that you have to build more collaborative frameworks in order to tackle such very difficult security situations. Militaries and guns and bombs, no matter how smart, interceptors and platforms are not going to solve the problem. Genuinely, what is going, because you, that is a war. What do you do about the protection of critical infrastructure, right? That is a different kind of a ball game. That's a different kind of skill set, right? Usually the protection of critical infrastructure, you have to involve the non-state actors, you have to involve the big tech, the private players, right? So long and short is you have to build collaborative frameworks. Security has to be done as a collective, right? No one country, look at Indo-Pacific, no one country can take on China. It's very, very obvious. So what do? Right? There are also countries that are dependent on China who want to take on China, right? China is actively doing a lot of misinformation and disinformation. We saw that in Operation Sindoor. We keep seeing that in Taiwan, etc. So long and short is, what should be our response? So I think more collaborative security sort of frameworks. Of course, conventional, we have to look at it like parallel vectors. Conventional capabilities is definitely a very, very important objective, and I think our own country should be spending much more money than merely 2% of our GDP. In fact, if you look at particularly capital procurement, it is still not enough. So, yes, without a doubt, more money on conventional military capabilities, more money on emerging technologies such as drones. Not just drones, drones is UAVs, is a very, very big cloud, right? Within that, you have different technologies. You have the optical cables, you have the AI enabled things, you have undersea drones, you have so much of variety. So, you have to talk about that. So that's on the one side. On the other hand, you have to develop cybersecurity, doctrines. You have to develop protection of critical infrastructure. You have to talk about how to tackle disinformation. You have to talk about all these things as well, because that's gray zone destabilization, right? And look at the world. The tragedy is the world is not just dealing with conventional military destabilization, glaring conventional military destabilization, but the world is also thrust into a situation of perpetual evergreen 24/7 gray zone destabilization, right? The wrong use of AI. I mean, we can just go on talking about that. So, like minded countries have to come together. I keep saying, for example, that in the Indo Pacific region, we have to create a more multi stakeholder kind of a collaborative model to take on hybrid threats, right? And for that, we need the Europeans. Why? Because I gave you the example of the Helsinki Center of Excellence. Please Google that. In fact, the audiences must also Google, because they, like, for example, do you know that India has a very, very important, robust cybersecurity dialogue with a country like Estonia? A tiny country in the Baltics. Why? Because Estonia, for the last many decades, has been at the receiving end of many, many cyber attacks from Russia. So they have developed certain capabilities, and that's why India has them. Anyway, so the Helsinki Cyber Hybrid Center of Excellence is an amazing sort of thing. And I keep referring to it not because it's the last word, because it has a lot of sort of gray zone tested capabilities that they can also bring to the Indo Pacific. But then you can't have one person doing it. So what I have always argued in my writings is that the European, and especially under Donald Trump, COD is also very, very uncertain. We know that COD is going to make a comeback, but we don't know whether during Donald Trump years it's going to see the same, so to say, mainstreaming. We are not sure of that at all. So what I have been arguing, and especially since we are doing this NATO Youth Conference, what I've been arguing is that the European Union, NATO as a back channel sort of support, as a background support, European Union, India, Australia, Japan, these kind of countries, along with more willing ASEAN countries, should create hybrid center of excellence for the Indo-Pacific, where you can bring in good practices, where you can make it more multi stakeholder. Basically, it is about rallying your effort in a manner that when you connect the dots, they don't just lead to splintered outputs, right? Please see what I'm saying, because we do a lot of things on this, okay, but they're very splintered, they're fragmented outputs, so that they can lead to genuine and coherent outcomes, right? So output versus outcomes. The times are such that we can no longer just keep thinking about it. We have to take action, and the action starts today.
I mean, you've spoken about so many things. I feel like our conversation could just go on from here, and I could ask you about, the wars and the tech. And I think how much you've spoken about the technology, I think we do need to do another podcast on technology separately. But I think, since we're having this NATO India Youth Conference, and in this world where a lot of confrontation is happening, right? You talk about splintered
Outputs.
outputs,
Yeah.
right? So the world is metaphorically operating in terms of splintered outputs. I think you've made one of the most genuine and most, how should I say, most genuine cases for collaboration. I think that's what's the spirit is here at the NATO India Youth Conference. And on that note, I would really like to thank you for your time, and we would like to see you again in the next conference. So thank you
Thank you
so
so
much.
much, Pratyaksh. It was an honor speaking to you again, and all the best to you for all the future endeavors.
Thank you so much, ma'am.